Hello friends, welcome to the course of Goods and Services Tax on Awdhesh Academy. Friends, the most important concept in the Goods and Services Tax is the concept of supply. Why it is most important? For every tax to be levied, there is something called taxable event. And the taxable event in the GST is the supply of goods and services or both. And therefore, it is extremely important for us to understand what is the meaning of supply under Goods and Services Tax. Section 2108 defines taxable supply means supply of goods or services or both which are liable to tax under the GST Act. So we can say that the taxable events under the GST is the supply of goods or services or both made for consideration in the course of furtherance of business. Let's understand that every supply is not taxable. Only certain supplies are taxable, and if we want to know whether the supply is taxable, we have to understand that it should satisfy by and large these 6 conditions. The first is that the supply should be involving a supply of goods or supply of services. That means it should be either by trading or by providing any service. So there has to be a supply. This is the first and foremost condition. The second important thing is that the supply should be for a consideration. That means suppose if I am doing something for free, then it is not taxable. Of course, there are exceptions that we will discuss later on. But by and large, there should be a consideration for supply. The third important thing is that the supply is for the furtherance of business. That means if I am not doing it for the sake of business, if let us say I am a charitable organization and I have got absolutely no business interest, I am serving the poor, doing everything for free, there is no business interest involved, and by and large it is not a taxable supply. The fourth important thing is that it should be done in the taxable territory. If suppose the supply is made outside the taxable territory, then also it is not a taxable supply. Then the fifth important thing is the supply should be a taxable supply. It means that if suppose on the supply the rate of tax is 0 or the supply is exempted or it falls under the exempted category, then also it will not be called a taxable supply. And finally, the supply should be made by a taxable person. If suppose somebody makes a supply who is not a taxable person, let us say Government of India, a state government who is not a taxable person, then also the supply cannot be said to be a taxable supply. So by and large, these 6 conditions has to be satisfied if we want to know whether this supply is a taxable supply or not, or whether GST is to be paid on these supplies or not. Let us first understand what is the meaning of supply. Supply word is not defined under the GST Act. We have to therefore derive the generic meaning of supply. In the business dictionary, the supply means the total amount of product, goods or services available for purchase at any specified price. That means there has to be a product, whether in the form of goods or services. Second, that it should be available to be purchased at a given price. If we refer to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says supply means to make available for use. So you are making something available for use, and that is called supply. So these are the generic meaning of the supply. There is an inclusive definition of supply which is given in the Act. Please remember, when we give the inclusive definition, it automatically means that we try to cover some sort of issues which are not strictly falling in the category of the general meaning of supply. Now, the definition of the supply includes, according to the section 7(1) of the Central GST Act, these things. Number 1, the supply of goods or services are both such as sales, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease or disposal made or agreed to be made for a consideration by a person in the course of furtherance of business. What does it mean? That even if it is an exchange where there is no financial transaction or lease, all these will fall in the category of supply. And it is not necessary that these supply is actually made. Even if it is agreed to be made, then also it will fall under the definition of supply. The second important thing is the import of services for a consideration whether or not in the course of furtherance of business. Please mark the word. It is only in the case of service, not in the case of goods. If it is a goods, then it is going to be covered under the Customs Act, import of the goods. But only in the case of import of services, a consideration aspect is very, very important. If you are importing of goods and there is no consideration, somebody is gifting you, then also it will be considered a supply. But if you are accepting a supply, importing a supply, for example, downloading something, in that situation, it will not be considered to be a supply unless it is in the course of furtherance of business. The C part is, or the third part is, that the activity is made or agreed to be made without a consideration if specified in the Schedule 1. So there is a list of schedule where certain supplies, for example, supplies between a related person. One company giving supply to another company of the same parents or the same company group and therefore not charging anything. In that situation, even if there is no consideration, it will fall under the category of supply. And the list is given in Schedule 1. Similarly, the activities has to be treated as supply of goods or services which are referred in Schedule 2. For example, if you are leasing a premises, if you are having a building and you are leasing it, actually you are not supplying any service. But this is considered to be a supply of service or a deemed supply because of the definition, because it falls under the Schedule 2. So certain services has been deliberately put under the umbrella of supply, even though strictly speaking they may not fall into the category of supply. We shall be dealing about these deemed supplies separately in a separate lesson. The government has also provided a list of activities which will not amount to supply even though all the conditions are supply are actually satisfied. So they have given a list 3 in the Schedule 3. Now these activities are not chargeable to GST even though they are meeting all the conditions of the supply. For example, employer-employee relationship. If you are working in a corporate, if you are working in a company, you are providing service to the company. But that type of transaction between the employer and the employee are excluded by the definition of supply because it is mentioned in the Schedule 3. In the same way, if the central government or the state government is providing certain services, then those services are also not be called supply and therefore no GST will be leviable on that. The government has also been empowered to classify certain supplies of goods which will not be a supply of services and certain supplies to be a supply of services which will not be supply of goods. Because by and large the GST Act does not differentiate between the supply of goods or services, but the government has the power to say that certain supplies are actually the supply of either services or goods. For example, job work. Now job work can be debated as supply of goods or supply of services, but the government has said no, it is a supply of services only. Now let us understand certain conditions about the supply of goods. If you are supplying goods, what should be the necessary conditions that has to be satisfied? This is important because sometimes there can be different rates on supply of goods or supply of services, and therefore we should know whether it is a supply of goods or it is supply of services. Now, in order for something to constitute a supply of goods, the title as well as the possession of the goods both should be transferred. If suppose you are only transferring the possession but you are not transferring the title, it will not be considered to be a supply of goods. For example, if you give a tractor for hire, a machine for hire, a car for hire, so full possession is there with the person but the title is not transferred, in that situation it will not be considered to be supply of goods, it will be considered to be supply of service. In the same way, sometime what may happen that the possession may be transferred immediately but the title may be transferred at a future date on approval basis or hire purchase agreement basis. So in this case also it is immaterial that the possession has been given now and the title will transfer later because both the conditions are satisfied, therefore it will be treated as the supply of goods. So the supply of goods will be there if there is a supply on the hire purchase basis because in that particular case the title is transferred later in a future date, but the possession is transferred there on the spot, but both are transferred and therefore it will be a supply of goods. So friends, today we have learned about the meaning of supply, what constitutes supply. Everything is not a supply, everything is not a taxable supply, and if we understand this concept of supply, we will be able to understand whether an activity is liable to tax or not under the GST Act. Thank you very much for watching the video.